I'm very pleased to welcome you to the inaugural meeting of the Sociology of Algorithms workshop at Columbia University. The aim of this workshop is to organize and encourage fruitful, critical, thoughtful conversations about the impact of the increasing reliance on algorithms and artificial intelligence. This impact in broad fields, the one that we will focus on today is criminal justice, and the impact is on all of us, but also specifically on minority and working class communities. We are, the purpose of the workshop is to bring together participants from various academic disciplines. So this is sociology of algorithms, but the sociology of algorithms is interdisciplinary. It's not just sociology. So we have two outstanding sociologists here, but we have also people from other disciplines, and this would be what we will do in this workshop. The idea is also to include in later iterations broader engaged public here in New York City, people who are working with or about algorithms. My name is Gil Eyal. I'm a professor of sociology at the department. My work is on experts and expertise, so it is somewhat related to algorithms. But the real force behind this workshop are my three co-organizers. They are all PhD students, the Department of Sociology, Hannah Pullen-Blasnik, Kieran Samuel, and Amy Wissenbach. They are, as I said, the real force behind this workshop. They are all doing cutting-edge research on issues related to algorithms. No less importantly, they are all profoundly committed to exploring and understanding the social justice issues that have to do with the increased reliance on algorithms. This is what inspired them to work on this workshop, to create this workshop. Before we continue, I just also want to thank the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy at Columbia University, its co-directors, Matt Conley and Tom DePreet, for providing the generous support that enabled this workshop. We could have brought you guys to New York and hosted you and took you out to restaurants and hosted you at hotels, etc. But, you know, we still have that money. Okay, I'm going to give Hannah a couple of minutes now to explain the etiquette of the webinar and the way we're going to organize the conversation. Please, Hannah.
Great. Thank you, Gil. Thank you all so much for being here for the first panel of ours. We're really excited, and we're so excited to have this amazing group of speakers here to talk with us about the role of algorithms in the criminal legal system. So thank you all for being here. Before we start, we just want to go over a couple of logistics. So we're going to have the panelists kind of introduce themselves and their work, and then we have a few discussion questions that we've come up with for the panelists. And then we reserved the last half hour of this for Q&A from the audience. So we really want you all to kind of feel free to be engaged. You can put questions in the chat at any point during this, and we'll surface them up into the conversation during the Q&A portion. And then you also should be able to raise your hand if you'd rather ask your question out loud, and we can call on you to unmute you for that as well during the Q&A section. Great.
Okay.
We're ready.
Let me say we have a wonderful panel here today. We have 4 speakers. They are Sarah Brayne, Angèle, Christin, Andrew Ferguson, and Kristian. I will introduce each of them in their turn in alphabetical order, and then they will speak. But before that, I also wanted the audience to know we presented a prompt to the speakers. They're, of course, completely free to speak about whatever they want, because they may think that our prompt, kind of missed the right issues or something along those lines. But I will read that prompt just so you get a sense of what we asked them. So the prompt asked the following: in recent decades, the logic of machine learning has come to mediate and govern decision-making in the criminal legal system with enormous material stakes. The reliance on big data and predictive modeling in such decision-making has a propensity for spectacular harms when not attuned to bias in the design, data, development, and implementation of these models. Many of these harms mirror the structural inequality of the material world, introducing and exacerbating inequality for already marginalized social groups. So in your work, how do you see power enacted through various algorithms in areas like surveillance, policing, assessing criminality, and courtroom decision-making? In recent years, there's also has been a significant push to prioritize fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics in machine learning. How has your work attended to these terms in more concrete ways? What considerations are crucial for future researchers, policymakers, and the engaged public to address? What are the opportunities for intervention? Our first speaker will be Sarah Brayne. She is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of Predict and Survey, Data, Discretion, and the Future of Policing. The Future of Policing by Oxford University Press, a book that draws on ethnographic research with the Los Angeles Police Department to understand how law enforcement uses predictive analytics and new surveillance technologies. In previous research, she analyzed also the relationship between criminal justice contact and involvement in medical, financial, and labor market and educational institutions. Her 2017 ASR article, Big Data Surveillance, the Case of Policing, won Best Article prizes from the Sociology of Law section of the ASA and from the Law and Society Association. Prior to joining the faculty at UT Austin, Brayne was postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research. She was she's also a volunteer teaching college credit sociology courses in prisons since 2012. And in 2017, she founded the Texas Prison Education Initiative. Sarah, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So this is so nice to be here today, and this is a great panel. We were just chatting before everyone else came on that I think we all are sort of citing and each other's work and everything all the time. So that's great. So someone asked if the prompt could be written into the chat. Oh yeah, okay, there we go. So yeah, in the prompt, basically, we were asked first to discuss how power is enacted through various algorithms. And so to answer that, I want to first take a step back into history to understand kind of what we're talking about here. Even though Silicon Valley rhetoric today really proclaims that big data and algorithmic decision-making and machine learning is this disruptive and transformative force, I think in many ways it's actually better understood as sort of the latest iteration in the centuries-long trend of statecraft. And so work by historians and political scientists, historical sociologists, has shown that the state has long used data to govern its citizens. So for centuries, state actors have translated social processes and populations into measures and metrics, things like the census being a basic example, in order to govern and enforce the law and allocate resources. But what I think is new and important today, or in recent years, is that the state is now relying more heavily on private vendors and platforms to collect, store, and analyze data about its citizenry. So this privatization is part of a broader sort of neoliberal turn in statecraft in which we've seen the privatization of a range of services like welfare, education, and then punishment and criminal justice more generally. And privatization has brought this logic of risk, the idea of actuarial calculations, increasingly using proprietary algorithms, to bear in ways that increasingly structure our life chances, like whether or not you get stopped by the police or get released on bail. But this, of course, extends far beyond criminal justice to whether or not you get a loan, get a job, this type of thing. And so just as the state has long used data for governance, I argue that similarly, there's a long history of police using data to legitimate their function and signal accountability to external constituencies, particularly in the face of criticism over discriminatory practices. So big data carries with it what Ted Porter calls this idea of mechanical objectivity, which is achieved in part by ostensibly stripping discretion from biased frontline actors. And so the police started using predictive analytics for many of the same reasons that other organizational actors did. It had the potential to improve both efficiency and accountability. So from a technical perspective, big data offered a means by which the police could more efficiently allocate resources, improve prediction, fill analytic gaps, that type of thing. Or if you take a more institutional perspective, the police adopted big data analytics, not necessarily just because there was empirical evidence that it actually increased efficiency, but rather because there was this kind of institutional pressure to conform as other institutions were starting to use and leverage big data and algorithmic predictions for their decision making. So when the police were sort of stuck in this, this dilemma, this challenge, they were simultaneously needing to efficiently allocate resources and then on this quest for objectivity and legitimacy. And so they turned to algorithms and technology and data. So in my case study example, which is the Los Angeles Police Department, they adopted a lot of the data-driven decision-making practices that they use today in response to external pressures for increased accountability. So basically, the 1990s was a really bad decade for the LAPD. They, were embroiled in all of these high-profile scandals throughout the decade, including the Rodney King beating, fallout from that, the Rampart scandal. And so after the discovery and disclosure of this pattern of, corruption, training deficiencies, civil rights violations, excessive force, unreasonable searches and seizures, the DOJ basically entered into a federal consent decree with the LAPD from 2001 to 2013. And this decree mandated the creation of a new data-driven employee risk management system, for example, new field data capture systems and department-wide audits. But I think that the legacy of this decree really extends beyond employee risk management and is associated with more information sharing and risk prediction and data-driven decision-making across the organization more broadly. So regardless of why big data was adopted, data originally collected for one purpose can be used for another. This is the idea of function creep, or the repurposing of data originally collected for one purpose and then using it for another unintended purpose. And so all this is to say that basically, although the field itself might look really different today than it did 100 years ago, these dilemmas that the organizational actors are facing are not entirely new, and neither is the solution of data and associated analytics. So the second part of the prompt then has to do with fairness and accountability and transparency and ethics in machine learning. And as I'm sure other panelists will probably speak about, these are complicated and loaded terms whose conception and especially their operationalization really varies across disciplines, and there are trade-offs that need to be made. But I'll just say this, that tracing the role of data throughout history, throughout the history of policing, for example, sheds fresh light on the foundations of data-intensive policing that we experience today. So this taken for granted narrative around big data suggests that it's new and it's transformative and it's disruptive and it may be objective or unbiased. But contrary to narratives coming out of the tech industry that data and advanced analytics are disruptive and reshaping the world as we know it, I think that data is better understood as a form of capital. So capital in the sense that it's both a social product, a social resource, and it's used by actors within organizations, and it has shifting utility over time and space. And it can be differentially leveraged and exchanged, accumulated and taken away. So for that reason alone, big data cannot possibly obviate inequality or these concerns that we have. Like other forms of capital, it's fundamentally transactional. Some people and groups have more of it than others, and it can be extracted from already disadvantaged populations. And so it's basically a resource with shifting utility over time. And I think that thinking of data as capital allows us to consider how police departments, like other organizations, are situated in this field with this whole constellation of organizations and actors involved not only in police activities like patrol or investigations, crime analysis, but also the courts, which like maybe Angèle might talk about, or Andrew, incarceration, even national defense. And they're all vying for and seeking legal compliance and organizational legitimacy and longevity. So in these different kinds of ways, we can kind of see how the motivations for adopting big data are social, and decisions about what data to collect on whom and for what purpose, those are all made by humans embedded in social and organizational contexts that are rife with all of these pre-existing priorities, preferences, imperatives, and constraints. And so humans embedded in organizations are operationalizing these socially significant concepts like crime or criminal risk into algorithmic infrastructures. And the ability to collect data and make decisions, construct policies, and importantly, intervene in others' lives based on that data is not evenly distributed. So I'm going to keep my remarks short. This brings me just to my last point, which is about this issue of accountability, transparency, and directions for future research and policy intervention. So I think that if we think of data as capital rather than some sort of mechanical reflection of the world, we can understand how accountability does not flow automatically from transparency. So if only the police have access to data, then accountability through data isn't really possible. So for example, there's this great idea of using big data to police the police, which I think has a lot of great potential, and other panelists have written a lot on this. And the logic underpinning this idea is basically that digital policing leaves digital trails are susceptible to oversight. And so there's this collateral consequence of new data intensive surveillance practices. That's the police themselves are increasingly subject to surveillance. But importantly, it's not usually by the public, it's by their managers. So big data can only be used to police the police if it operates sort of outside of this traditional police chain of command. If it continues to be just the police that have access to the data and not any external actors or organizations, then it's not going to necessarily lead to any increased accountability. So I'll leave my remarks there, but I'd love to chat more about that stuff in the Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah, for starting us off, thinking about, police departments and the kind of imperatives that they are facing and how algorithms assist them or do not in addressing this. I forgot to mention that Sarah got her PhD from Princeton, and our second speaker, Angèle Christin, also, I believe, got her PhD from Princeton. So we don't have sociologists here, we have Princeton sociologists here. Okay, but Angèle is assistant professor of communications and sociology and science, technology, and society at Stanford University. She studies how algorithms and analytics transform professional values, expertise, and work practices. Her book, Metrics at Work, I can do that too. Though without the mirroring, so mine is, mirror image. Focuses on the case of web journalism, analyzing the growing importance of audience data in web newsrooms in the United States and France. In a related project, she studied also the construction, institutionalization, and reception of predictive algorithms in the United States criminal justice system. And in a new project, she examines the paradoxes of algorithmic labor. I would love to hear about that, also through a study of influencers on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Okay, Angèle, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for all this kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here, especially because I'm, as I said, like a big fan of everybody on this panel. I come to the question of algorithms in the criminal justice context from a bit of a weird perspective, in the sense that I'm not originally a specialist of criminal justice, in the sense that that's not what my dissertation, what my book is about. My book is about journalism and the uses of metrics and analytics in the journalism case. As I started, right after my dissertation, I did a postdoc at Data and Society, and I started kind of being part of discussions about the role of predictive algorithms in the criminal justice context. And that was of particular interest for me for two reasons. The first one is that before coming to the US and before doing my PhD at Princeton, I had published a book in French about legal decision-making in a criminal court located in the outskirts of Paris during what's called the urban riots of 2005-2006. So I had this kind of past interest in criminal justice and in how kind of decision-making takes place, how sentencing decisions are made, and what kind of bias gets embedded within these decision-making processes. And so I had done a lot of fieldwork on that. And when I came to data and society, I realized that there was this kind of growing interest for predictive algorithms in the criminal justice context. Now, what's interesting about the literature and most of the research on risk assessment tools, as they're called in criminal justice, is that following in particular the publication in 2016 of Julia Engwins and her team article called Machine Biased that does a quantitative analysis of Compass, one of the main risk assessment tools being used in the US, in which the team shows that it is biased in specific ways against African Americans. Definition of bias that itself has been contested kind of further down the lines by several computer scientists and data scientists, kind of raising a whole debate about algorithmic fairness, what it looks like, what can be done, what cannot be done in the context of risk assessment tools. I was kind of struck as an ethnographer and as someone interested in expert decision-making in how like most of the discussion was about the instruments themselves and not so much about criminal courts. And so that for me was super interesting because when you read a lot of the media coverage about risk assessment tools, it's basically this image of like, it's like Terminator, right? It's like RoboCop. It's just like, wow, they're so on top of technology. And as someone who had spent quite a number of months and quite some time in criminal courts, that's not really the vibes that you get when you're in a criminal court. It's not exactly Terminator. It's very dysfunctional, it's very biased, it's very racist, but there's a lot of people pushing carts with paper files in it. And so I was kind of really curious. I was just like, wait, how do you reconcile this whole like kind of Terminator type, you know, oh, like we're being sentenced based on crimes that we haven't committed yet, like, you know, it's really awful. And kind of my own experience as an ethnographer, spending time with judges and prosecutors where they were just, I mean, don't get me wrong, these are extremely problematic institutions, but where bias is embedded within institutional structures and not so much technological systems, or not only technological systems. And so based on that kind of question and puzzle, and I was interested in kind of having a comparative case compared to the journalism one, which is the one I focused on, I decided to do fieldwork in several criminal courts in the United States. And so I spent time in well, mostly in the South, and some on the East Coast and some on the West Coast, getting access to different criminal courts, often through technology teams, sometimes through judges and prosecutors who are interested in having an ethnographer around. I did interviews with judges, prosecutors, social workers, and kind of followed them in their daily work and kind of observed how they were kind of using risk assessment tools, knowing that all the courts that I studied were using several risk assessment instruments, Compass, but also other risk assessment instruments that were more specialized, usually for sexual offenders, domestic violence, pretrial, etc. And so based on that fieldwork, I realized a couple of things, which I'll summarize very quickly here. The first one was that there was a major decoupling, to use kind of a traditional sociological term, between what, shall we say, the administration of the court and its public representatives were saying and what was actually going on the ground, meaning like in the audience rooms, during hearings, in the day-to-day practices of judges, prosecutors, social workers, lawyers, etc. And that decoupling was the following. When you kind of interviewed the kind of top administrators or the kind of people speaking for the criminal court or the county, they were like, yes, we are so data driven, we're using all the technologies, we're on top of things, we understand that technology is really going to change how we kind of address legal sentencing, we're very concerned about efficiency and bias, and we are really using technology to kind of, you know, we're harnessing technology is a kind of usual metaphor to really do that. Whereas in fact, when you spend time kind of in the, you know, day-to-day kind of administration of criminal courts, and when you spend time at hearings and with judges and prosecutors, I barely ever saw risk assessment tools being used. No one was mentioning them. When I was asking people about them, they were like, oh, what? Oh, yeah, yeah, I think we use one of those. I'm not sure. Let me ask, well, why don't you ask my colleague, and, you know, perhaps they'll know about it. So, you know, this kind of like very strong decoupling between the kind of top of the administration and the kind of lower part of the administrations. The second thing that was very striking was that when I asked judges and prosecutors who were aware of that, you know, there were risk assessment tools, etc., they were very critical of these tools, and they were very critical in a variety of ways. Some of them had read the Compass, the kind of ProPublica article and the literature on this, and were like, listen, like we're being asked to like solve bias with bias, which doesn't seem like it's gonna take us anywhere. So I don't understand why we should do this. And then you also had a more kind of traditional kind of professional backlashing, which is like, listen, these algorithms are doing what we're doing. Now, I've been a judge or I've been a prosecutor for, you know, 10, 20, 30 years. I'm a civil servant. You know, I believe in what I do. I don't understand why I should follow the recommendations of that tool that's been built by companies I don't know, using data I don't understand, with a model I have no grasp on, because, you know, in part I haven't been trained in statistics. That's not my job. And why should I trust these tools to make the same decisions that I'm making? So kind of a second kind of justification along these lines. And a third one, which I, you know, at the end of the day as an ethnographer is often when you encounter, but which was just like, the tool is bad. Risk assessment tools are bad. They just tell us things that are obvious. You know, that's not changing anything to us. So here I should kind of add like a caveat, which is that, you know, this is ethnographic material. So it's only based on like 3 jurisdictions which are very specific. So I'm not saying that this is how judges and prosecutors are using risk assessment tools across the US. And in fact, especially with the kind of latest risk assessment tool, which is PSA Court, developed by Arnold Venture, there is a much more kind of, shall we say, controlled use of the tool, especially to change pretrial decisions. And I'm happy to talk more about what that looked like. So all of this to say that this is not generalizable, but it does kind of cast a bit of a different light on the question of like, you know, terminator justice and bias being entrenched within organizations, as in like, the tools are bad, they are problematic. I think there is no doubt about it, that, you know, regardless of the definition of fairness you adopt, the tools are going to have problems, and they're going to have problems because they draw on historical data, and so, you know, you get the kind of garbage in, garbage out process. That's just the way it's going to be, and I'm sure that the other panelists will talk a bit more about that. But that's not the only way in which you have to look at these tools. You also have to look at how they're used in practice, and so this is kind of where my intervention as an ethnographer is, which is like, you know, the instruments themselves are important, interesting, we need to study them, we need to audit them, we need to understand what's going on there, but we also need to understand what's going on when they're used in the wild, you know, as a kind of user experience people often say. It's like how they're being used on the ground, or as sociologists would say, in practice. And that leads me to the last part, the last interesting finding, which we talk a bit about in the paper we wrote with Sarah, where we compare the uses of predictive technologies in policing and criminal courts, which is the ways that, so these tools are designed to kind of make decision-making processes more objective, right? But in fact, when you spend time in courts, and it's the same in police departments, you realize that instead of like erasing discretion, it just kind of moves discretion to like either before or after the moment when that specific segment is being objectified, right? And so in the case of criminal courts, what was striking was talking with social workers. So social workers are the ones who fill up the surveys and fill up the instruments, the variables in the risk assessment tools, and then, you know, click on calculate risk, and then they usually print out the sheet with the risk scores and they add it to the file, and the file is being brought to the hearings. I mean, now things are moving to online, but it's still social workers doing most of the work, right? And social workers who are interacting with these tools, these risk assessment tools, like throughout the day, filling up kind of variables and surveys and little questionnaires and computing the scores throughout the day, know very well how to manipulate the tools. I haven't observed myself social workers manipulating the tools, but they all told me, oh yeah, if I wanted to, I could. And so, you know, and they know very well, like there are a couple of variables usually that are a bit subjective, or that, you know, have some, they can be like tweaked a tiny bit, right? And they kind of know how, you know, they could kind of change the kind of information they enter in the tool to get the kind of risk scores that they think is adequate for the defendant. So again, like, you know, when we think about objectifying decision-making through technology, I think that one of the values of doing ethnographic research is being like, well, so where does discretion go? Right? Is it really being erased, or is it just moving to slightly different places and more unaccountable places in the organizations? Because whether you love or hate judges or prosecutors, they are on the front scene and they're responsible for the decisions they make, for better or for worse, again. Whereas like when discretionary power moves to unaccountable places in the organizations, there is really no way of tracing it, and it makes it much harder to address it, I think, to some extent. So I'll conclude here in terms of avenues for further research. Again, coming to this topic from a kind of ethnographic perspective, I'm really interested in kind of making sure that when we study algorithms and algorithmic technologies, which are mediating more and more of our social, cultural, economic, political, you name it, processes, we look not only at the internal features of the instruments, which are very important, which should be analyzed, which, you know, there has to be some work kind of auditing and kind of making these kind of opaque technologies more transparent, but also at how they're used by people, by institutions, what kind of political role are they being made to play, and what are some of the unintended consequences that take place when these algorithms are used in the wild. And so I'll perhaps end here.
Thank you, Angèle, for this provocative set of observations. I think together with Sarah, you sort of collectively thrown some cold water on the disruption talk and told us, well, the future's not here yet. Though I would correct the Hollywood reference. It's not the Terminator, it's Minority Report, I think, that is the future being held here. All right. Our third speaker is Andrew Ferguson. He is a professor of law at American University in DC, Washington, the School of Law. His most recent book is The Rise of Big Data Policing, Surveillance, Race, and the Future of Law Enforcement. The book examines how surveillance technology and predictive analytics shapes modern policing. Before joining the law faculty, Professor Ferguson worked as a supervising attorney at the Public Defender's Service for the District of Columbia. And as a public defender for 7 years, he represented adults and juveniles in serious felony cases ranging from homicide to misdemeanor offenses. He's a nationally recognized expert on juries, predictive policing, and the Fourth Amendment. His articles have appeared in various of the law reviews, from the Pennsylvania Law Review, the UCLA Law Review, the Cornell Law Review, etc. His legal commentary has been featured in numerous media outlets, including CNN, NPR, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, the Economist, etc. Professor Ferguson, please, the floor is yours.
Sorry, time myself here. Well, thank you very much. So I am a law professor who studies new technologies, who studies predictive policing and big data surveillance and the Internet of Things. And I have spent my time pretty much as a critic who critiques these technologies for concerns about civil liberties or civil rights, a critic who sometimes critiques the critics who also have had challenges sometimes when they overstep. And I found myself most recently critiquing everyone. And maybe that's just my nature. Maybe it's being stuck in the house for 8 months. But I found that the debate about algorithms and policing has reached an impasse that really goes to first principles, which is what I want to talk about today, about how we think about first principles for addressing this difficult question of what do we do about these new technologies. So we can be talking about predictive policing, we can be talking about facial recognition, we can be talking about surveillance technologies. But we see that over the last decade, I really think it's been the last decade to focus on, that there have been three sort of approaches to new technologies. We can see sort of the trust us mentality, and I'll talk about that. We'll see kind of a trap mentality where everything about surveillance is a trap and we need to just have no more surveillance technologies. And then sort of a technocratic approach. And where we are now is that those voices, which are all incredibly important voices, have essentially silenced each other or aren't even speaking to each other because they begin on and around their own first principles. And they're correct if you accept their first principles. If you trust police, giving police surveillance technology is fine. If you don't trust police, then there's be no reason to give them any more power, because we know when you add on the bias of policing to the bias of technology, it doesn't improve, it gets worse. And then there's the technocrats who have tried to sort of walk the walk in between them, have been attacked on both sides. The most recent example of this actually is in facial recognition technology. This new innovation that has essentially been adopted by police without a whole lot of oversight, without a whole lot of regulations or rules. The response from the civil liberties communities rightly has been to abolish it. We should not have it. It should not enter at all. The technocrats have been attacked on both sides, and we're sort of left at a place where we can't move forward. And so I've been struggling. I'm struggling with the prompt of thinking about not how do I solve it, but how do you, the audience here, who are a lot of smart people interested in this area, think about solving these sort of first principles. And I want to sort of trace out what I see as our prior experience in coming up with different versions of these tests and show why they may have made sense and also why they failed and why we need something new. So the first example is what I call the trust lens. And really, if you go back over the last decade, if not centuries, we have sort of defaulted to a trust the police mentality. And when we're talking about new technologies or predictive policing and facial recognition, that was the way we did it. We said, here's a new technology, some company invented it, we gave it to police used it, there are literally no regulations, no rules, no policies, no oversight, and guess what? It didn't work so well. But that had been our going. And if you trust the police to use power well, then that can be your way of approaching it. But I think if we've learned anything recently, that may not have been the best way. And we need to think about different ways. In response, but also it's been around forever, is what I call the trap test, in that this is a trap. That if you give new surveillance technologies to police, it will be misused. And the way we know that is the history of policing. There is almost no moment where the extra power has not been misused. So why on earth would we think that new surveillance technologies, new algorithms, new anything else will not also be misused? And in fact, if you study them and you break them apart, you see all of the bias that is baked into the systems. You see, great examples of terrible decision making in terms of like the Chicago heat list and their idea of being able to use person-based predictive policing, the laser program in LA as a terrible way to set up a program, a terrible way to operationalize a program, and obviously it failed, which is why both programs have been shut down. And so the trap advocates, the people who are pushing to abolish surveillance because police have never risen to the challenge to do this honorably, have a strong argument to say that if you can't point to a moment where you've used this right, why would we ever choose that there? And that runs against some of our inclination that, well, A, the status quo without technology isn't great, and B, we kind of have this still somewhat utopian hope that maybe technology can improve policing in some way because the bar is so low in order to build upon it. But if you study what is happening with sort of the abolish surveillance movement, that's sort of a parallel to abolish the police, it's been fairly successful. There have been jurisdictions in California and in Boston, I think Massachusetts, where facial recognition is now off the table. Predictive policing has been banned in certain cities, including Santa Cruz, which was like one of the premier places where it began. And you can see this sort of other a way of approaching the technology. The third lens that I just talked about is this technocratic approach. This idea that maybe what we need is democratic accountability. We need front-end policies. We need auditing. We need sort of systems in place to be able to make sure the technology is used appropriately. And like for most of my career, including my book, it's sort of a technocratic approach. This sort of hope that, well, the best we can do in a messy democracy is to try to build policies, write procedures, create audits, and actually have some levels of transparency, which gets to some of the prompt, that might be an approach. But I actually think that maybe it's not enough. It's not that it couldn't work, it just hasn't worked. And that should tell us something. And so I think we need a new approach. I think we need a new approach from the ones we've done. I'm sort of working on a paper where I have one, but I don't want to say that this is an answer. It's just an answer. And you very well may have a better answer out there to think about how we begin with first principles. And my new approach, or my theory, is what I call the tyrant test. It is, say, to assume that the power you are giving police, that you are democratically handing over to police, is going to potentially destroy liberty. It's going to be misused. It is going to be abused. And then how do you build the systems in place to protect against knowing that that will happen? What would you do? And the metaphor I use, sort of an analytical way in the paper, is to say, well, we've done this in other times. Like, in fact, if you go look at like the US Constitution and the Fourth Amendment, like we were facing a tyrannical experiment. We didn't want the federal government to have the power that the British had. We were worried about surveillance, British surveillance. We were worried about arbitrary policing. We were worried about some of these things at the same time. So what do? We built a system that decentered power from the government and put it back into the people. And to use that as a metaphor, as a way to build institutions of power to control surveillance technologies that do not center on police, that do not center on government, but actually center on people. In some ways, to what Sarah had said, in terms of the way of how to use how to use technology to create police accountability, the goal can't be to have the data about police in police hands. It has to be in the community. It has to be decentered, right? And I think in some ways that is a way, if you think about sort of structural mechanisms, enforcement of rights, actual like things like juries or institutions of decentered power that can use it, you can come up with ways to recognize that this technology we're going to give you, whatever it is, some predictive algorithm, some facial recognition technology, which is going to be misused, can be pulled back if you have enough structures. It's messy, it's slow, it ain't fancy, Silicon Valley innovation, but it's also a way that can build out some ways to allow some technologies to go forward and some not. But my final point, and I'll stop, is I want to caution that I think the problem, even if the solution that I just posited is stupid, the problem is real, which is that we need to get past this impasse of first principles of how do we approach these technologies? Because when we can't, what happens is that the technologies keep going forward. Right now in facial recognition, despite the few places that are banned, because there's an impasse between the people who want it, the people who don't want it, and the technocrats who are getting attacked both ways, we haven't moved forward, and the technology has moved forward, and police are adopting it anyway. And so I think we need to figure out first principles to be able to move forward and have a conversation. I think power is important. I think researching places to center power is important. And I think that's a way forward to thinking about new algorithms and policing algorithms.
Thank you, Andrew. This was really thought-provoking. It made me think, and I'm not asking you to answer this now, but it made me think that when we're talking about algorithms, maybe we want to make a distinction between predictive ones and ones that are not predictive, because I think we might want to have, I know you were suggesting an approach, that was towards algorithms altogether, but perhaps, we may want to have one towards predictive ones, the whole idea that we engage in prediction, and another towards other kinds of algorithms. Our fourth and last speaker on the panel is Christian. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Computer and Information Science at UPenn. Previously, she was the lead statistician at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, where she led the project on criminal justice in the United States. She's widely known for her work on algorithmic fairness and predictive policing. She has consulted for a number of city governments on policy issues and risk assessment, and her research primarily focuses on examining the use of machine learning in the criminal justice system and has concretely demonstrated the potential for machine learning-based predictive policing models to reinforce and in some cases amplify historical racial biases in law enforcement. Kristian received her PhD from the Department of Statistical Science at Duke University. Please, Kristian, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the nice intro. And like everybody else said, it's nice to be here. It's unusual with an L last name to be last alphabetically out of 4. I'm a statistician. I imagine I could calculate the probability, but that surprised me when you pointed out that you were going alphabetically and I was going to be last. So what I want to talk about today, there were sort of 3 questions in the initial prompt. The first one about how technology centers power. I'm very glad we had some sociologists here to talk about that because that's not what I want to talk about. Like you said in the introduction, I'm a statistician, though I am currently in the computer science department. I definitely think of myself as a statistician. And so a lot of my work has been more quantitative in nature. And so I really want to take the bait on the second question about fairness, accountability, and transparency, and talk a little bit about some of my work in that area, in particular, fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, statistics, et cetera. And in particular, I want to talk about this in the context of risk assessment models, which have already been discussed by Angèle. But just to make sure we're all on the same page really quickly, essentially what I'm talking about are predictive models that predict some outcome that is relevant to decision makers, that is usually in the context that I've been looking at, which is pre-trial, something like whether the person will fail to appear if they've been released, whether they will be rearrested, though that is usually conceptualized as reoffense, and there are likely differences between those things, or something like whether they will be rearrested for a violent offense, or sometimes some composite of those things, like any of those possible outcomes. And so they are based on some set of predictive factors, usually things like criminal history, sometimes things like interviews, and then a statistical model, if we're talking about an actuarial risk assessment, is fit to that data to make predictions going forward. And those are used then, of course, to impact decisions about real people. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I imagine many of us are on the same page about that, but I just wanted to make sure before I go forward. And so over the last several years, I've been thinking about these issues, the fairness, the accountability, and the transparency, really in the context of risk assessment. So I wanted to give you a little tour of some of the things I've been thinking with respect to each of those big topics. So with respect to fairness, I think a lot of my work over the past couple of years has been on exposing ways in which algorithms might not lead to the fairer world we've been promised that they will. So for example, doing types of audits, maybe that's too strong of a word, but looking at the performance of various risk assessment models with respect to things like racial disparities. Like, my understanding is that people who originally got into this risk assessment business, however many decades ago, didn't necessarily think that this was going to be a tool for reducing racial disparities in the criminal justice system. But as we've seen, reform movements coming around, I think a lot of people have pinned their hopes to risk assessment models doing that. And like Angèle mentioned earlier, depending on how you splice the data, it can be argued that they are behaving in ways that are unfair. And I think the one way that is probably most relevant to understanding what their impact is on racial disparities, which I think is less discussed in the context of different mathematical notions of fairness, is just what percentage of people by race group are allocated to the do not release or the sort of highest risk groups. And in many cases, those are very different across race groups, even if, say, for example, the predictive accuracy is the same across the groups, et cetera. And this is, of course, often chalked up to differences in base rates, and that's sort of the crux of the algorithmic fairness debate, talking about an impasse, that one sort of got left at an impasse too. Essentially, there are different reasonable demands you could make on a model in order to be able to say, we think this is behaving fairly with respect to, say, race or gender. And in a world that is unfair, by which I mean there are disparities among those groups in, say, rates of rearrest, rates of anything really, rates of past arrest. You can't satisfy all of those somewhat reasonable demands of the model. You'll have to make decisions about what types of fairness you want to prioritize, and that's just sort of a mathematical fact. But one of the things I've noticed in working with folks who are trying to redesign risk assessment tools is when we talk about that situation, we're often assuming that a lot of things are fixed. So the factors that go into the model are fixed. Those base rates are fixed. Like the thing that you are trying to predict is necessarily fixed. And what I want to suggest here is that I think some ways past that impasse are sort of thinking about the knobs that you can turn that, and I should caveat this, once you've decided that you're going to do a model, which is, I don't think should be a foregone conclusion, but if that's the approach you're going to take, there are more knobs to be turned, right? So sort of reimagining the thing that you're predicting. A lot of times what's predicted is, say, any failure to appear at all during the course of someone's case. Even if, and these are unreasonably large numbers, but for example, someone appears 99 times out of 100, if they miss that 100th one, well, that is a 1, not a 0. That is a failure to appear for them. And so they don't really get credit in the models as they're built for their, remarkable ability to in fact appear. So, thinking about ways you can redefine those variables so that what you're predicting, one, might not have the levels of disparities that we're seeing, might more reasonably reflect things that people care about in the real world, and might also contribute to reducing the disparities that you see, because the way you're choosing to define the data or the predictive objective doesn't exhibit the disparities that you're seeing. Another thing that's often criticized in the failure to appear paradigm is that many people who fail to appear, although that's often conceptualized as flight risk, many of those people, in fact, are not fleeing. They have simply missed their court appointment due to confusing messaging around when it is, inability to arrive, etc. And so, I think some of my other work in this area has also recently, and this is sort of a preview of something that I'm hoping to get out fairly soon, is sort of around servicing alternative notions of fairness or justice in this context. So a lot of the past discussion of statistical certainty in this area has been really kind of tied up in I would say older statistical methods, looking at differences between groups, et cetera. And although there are some conceptual limitations to what we can say about what we're talking about when we're talking about an individual's probability, that gets fairly philosophical, I think there are some modeling approaches we can use to tease out how variable individuals are within groups in terms of their propensity for the outcome. And so in some upcoming work that I hope to have out very soon, I actually look at that and find that once you do that binning of individuals into the risk groups, I find that people within the same risk group are widely variable in terms of their propensity or their probability of the stated outcome, to the point where if you were to say, ask me on the basis of this model what percentage of people are assigned to the quote correct risk group, it would be something like 20 to 30%. Just because even though people's expected probability is very small, the variability about that is very large. And that's hard to see when we're talking about probabilities and when we're observing binary outcomes, but that's, you can sort of get around that with statistical modeling. When it comes to accountability, I will go quickly here because I don't want to take too much time. One of the ways that I've been thinking about auditing these sorts of risk assessment models is really driven by my partnerships, usually with public defenders. So I've worked with New York and San Francisco at this point, and I was working with San Francisco, and they were concerned about accountability for the inputs. And this really gets back to something Angèle was saying just a few moments ago. And so one of the things I was really interested in looking at there was the role of overbooking in a particular risk assessment. So the Arnold PSA, which takes in booking charges. as one of the inputs. And the idea here is that, there's quite a bit of discretion about what the particular charges actually are. And in an effort to expedite the release of low risk people, they plug those booking charges into the model without really any sort of second look or scrutiny as to how accurately those reflect the evidence for that case. And so again, I mean, there are a lot of complications to this, right? You want to get it turned around quickly. There's all sorts of process, but also there's a lot of variability and discretion at that point. And so in a project with San Francisco, we looked at the role of overbooking. So essentially looked at the predictions from a risk assessment model using those booking charges, then got data from the court system, waited 2 years, looked at the charges the individuals were actually convicted of, reran the risk assessment using only those charges to see what percent of people were assigned a higher risk group, so assigned a higher recommended level of supervision based only on charges that were ultimately unsubstantiated by the system or by the process, right? And without going into too much detail here, if you look at the model, and as somebody who hasn't, say, worked as a lawyer, I don't have a law degree, so I couldn't, but you look at the model, and you look at the charges that will trigger these increases and how those booking charges play out in the model, and you'd look at it and you'd think, oh, it's only very, very serious things. Certainly it's not the case that a large proportion of these people are being booked under these charges that seem really high when you look at them and seem very serious, but aren't ultimately convicted of those things. So that charge itself is what causes them to have that higher recommendation. But in fact, we found about 27% of cases, and a person was actually recommended a higher level of supervision, again, based only on a charge that was ultimately unsubstantiated. And the final area I want to talk about really quickly is the T in the fact trio here, the transparency. And I think, at least in the machine learning and statistics space, when we talk about transparency, often what we're talking about is that a human has access to the model. For example, they know what the weights are that are going in, they know what the factors are that go into the model. They know what the weight, how each of those factors is weighted. And maybe also, usually also, that the model is simple enough such that a human can look at the model, look at those factors, and kind of understand all at once holistically what's going on, right? It's not so complex that even if you have access to those factors and those weights, you can't possibly reason about how it's all going to play out after everything's been pushed through the model. And I think that's one reasonable way to think about transparency. But another form of transparency that I've looked into recently is sort of transparency into the process, which I think some other folks already talked about here a little bit, including Andrew. And so in one example, I looked at the creation of the risk assessment tool used in New York City, their supervised release tool, where if someone is assigned to the highest risk group, they're ineligible for the supervised release program. So this really is making, consequential decisions about real people. And, with the collaboration of the folks who built it, I tried to reproduce the model sort of from scratch. I got access to the data. They gave me this really great methodological report on how they had done it, including some Stata code, which I don't use Stata, I translated it. But at the end of the day, I actually couldn't reproduce the final model that was being used in the real world. And so after quite a bit of back and forth about what had happened, it turned out what we think, and honestly, we don't know. No, this is all sort of lost to history, what the whole process was, right? What it seems actually happened is this organization sort of came up with 3 different models. They split the data into different parts, built 3 different models, went back to the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice with these 3 different models. And at that point, the Mayor's Office gave input about which weights or which factors they would like to use. So they built, say, a model using so there's the same features or the same factors across all of the different models. They fit it once and get one set of weights. They fit it a second time, get a different set of weights. Fit it a third time, get a different set of weights. They have 3 different sets of weights to choose from. And then the Mayor's Office went well, we like the weight on being young from this random split, but we like the weight on number of priors from this split. So they kind of Frankensteined together this model that's not even entirely internally consistent, but it was certainly meeting some criteria or some goal, right? And so when I looked into why on earth would you do that, I don't know. Again, this is all lost to history, right? But one of the things that if someone were asking me to speculate, and nobody is, but just let me do it anyway. If I were to when I looked at who was benefiting from this sort of hand selection of the weights, it seemed like well, it was true that the demographic groups that were benefiting the most were young Black men. And given that the data that was used to build the model came from the height of stop and frisk, my suspicion is what's happening is they built this model using this, using statistical modeling, and then kind of put their thumbs on the scale in some way, being like, look, we know the data is kind of messed up for that reason. Let's pick weights such that we're sort of under predicting for that group in sort of a nod to fairness, but a very ad hoc and quantitative nod to fairness, which again, if we're talking about these tools as being some kind of objective measure or being, entirely data driven, that's a problem. And so, I think, that was a really interesting project for me because it really got me thinking about transparency sort of in a different sense, sort of transparency about in regards to who's at the table when those decisions, those sort of really mundane and boring data processing decisions are being made, because at the end of the day, you do have a tool that looks quantitative, that looks data driven, that maybe looks objective, but all along the way, humans are making these decisions. And whether you agree with that decision or not, on based on the sort of justification that I'm putting forward, I don't know if that's true. It could have obviously gone in a very different direction without safeguards in place. So let me see. One final comment. I've sort of thought about this in the context of fairness, accountability, and transparency. But often when I think about this, and that's just for convenience and maybe cuteness, because that's the topics that people talk about, and I like to be able to hit all the big three there. But when I really think about it myself, I really think it all, in a lot of ways, comes back to fairness. So in the first case, we're talking about, fairness of the model itself, sort of internally. Does this model behave in a way that's, fair by whatever definition you want to talk about? For the second part, I think it's more about fairness in the use of the model. Are people using the model in a fair way? Are the inputs that are going into the model being developed or recorded in a way that reflects some notion of fairness? And then the third one, I'm really thinking about fairness in the whole process. So fairness in who's there, who's getting to make those decisions. So that is where I will end.
Great. Thank you all so much for your insightful comments. I think, I learned a whole bunch from listening to you, and it's really interesting to me to hear you all in conversation coming from all these different disciplines as well. Is really exciting to see how this topic is so important across all these different perspectives. So I'm gonna just open us up with some discussion questions, but I do want to remind the audience, please start posting your questions in the chat because we'd love to hear from you as well and get your thoughts as well on this. So. But yeah, so I wanted to kind of pick up on that last point that you just mentioned, Dr. Lum, in talking about the roles of grounding a topic on the treatment of algorithms as agentic, as having responsibility, and kind of where that responsibility lies, and kind of who's holding it in different ways. And there seems to be a call kind of broadly that you've all touched on in various ways to view these problems that are often approached as kind of by default solvable with computation, instead to think about the social structures that they're embedded in and their social effects that they have more broadly. And so I want to ask you all, what are your thoughts on how we approach bias in the systems and how we should be kind of thinking about who's responsible for ethics in AI? Is that someone's job? Is it something that we're all collectively responsible for? And what does that accountability really look like for us? I guess we can start it off there. Do any of you want to take a first pass at that?
I'm happy to jump in, but I'm happy also to defer if anyone wants to.
Go for it.
So, I think we're in trouble. I think we're in trouble because all of the incentives for figuring out how to use technology wisely are misaligned. We have, generally devolved and defaulted to technology companies, either startups themselves or even sort of organic programs like, take the Arnold's, Foundation's PSA or Chicago Police or NYPD. They create their own algorithms. But they start with the algorithms, and so they get to define the problems, they get to define the terms, they get to define the weights, and they aren't in conversation with Dr. Lum and other people who might be able to get them to rethink that. And by the time it reaches the government from the technology companies to the a vendor that sells it to the police chief, who's no data scientists themselves. A lot of it's been baked in, and it's very hard to unwind. And the conversation doesn't begin as you would hope it would begin, which would begin with like, who's being impacted? Like if we go to communities and say, all right, there are things that we might consider a problem in our communities. There might be a lack of educational opportunities, lack of opportunities. There might be other kinds of criminal risk factors. So how do we want to think about identifying those problems, defining those problems, and maybe solving those problems using technology? And that conversation doesn't happen. I mean, maybe it'll happen now with a bit more of the defund, decenter policing to be focused on the communities, but it hasn't happened before. And none of the economic interests, none of the sort of other drivers of technology make it likely to have it happen in the way that it should. And so I think that it's a really difficult problem to begin again, to scratch out the innovative work of Silicon Valley and bring in civil rights advocates, bring in community members, bring in the experts who understand this, and have that first conversation about, so what are we doing with this? And the reason why they're not having that conversation is, what the answer is going to be like? Why are you putting money in for technology? Like, let's build schools, let's get jobs, let's do other things. Like, why on earth would you have the opportunity cost of spending money on this when you could be building communities, not technology? And that's why they don't want to have the conversation. That's why we haven't had the conversation. And that's why we keep getting driven by technology that are defining and creating the paradigms that we know are problematic, that could be fixed, as Dr. Lum said, but haven't been because of who's in that room when they are being decided.
If I could just jump on the who's in the room question. This is maybe, something that I've taken way too much of an interest in. But I think one of the problems that I've seen in practice when trying to include impacted communities, and I agree that is of the utmost importance, right? That they'll have a perspective on this that might be totally different and might sort of transform how even we're thinking about this. In the instances where I've seen that try to happen, it comes down to funding. Like, in at least one example I can think of, I go to those meetings to talk about what a tool might look like or might not look like if we're not going to do it at all, right? And I go there, like I have a salary from the university. I consider it part of my professional, responsibilities to go to these things, and I show up and I do it, and I'm not taking a pay cut to do that. On the other hand, when we're asking people from the community to show up and do it, many of them are not doing it as part of their sort of professional work. They're doing it on the side. And even efforts to get them paid for that time it's been really challenging due to rules from the city that they can't pay people to participate in this sort of panel, which I think probably makes a lot of sense and is probably founded in good intentions around, not wanting people to appoint their buddies to some sort of, do nothing sort of council and then get a bunch of money from it, right? So I understand where it's coming from, but at the same time, I think a real challenge is realizing that if we're asking impacted communities to participate in this process, it's kind of not fair that I get to show up as, university faculty getting paid for it, and what they're getting out of showing up is that maybe their community is treated a little less poorly, but they have to, say, take time off from work to do it.
I can kind of jump in. I mean, I think for me, one of the things that I've been struggling with, and I would love to hear what other people are thinking about it. I mean, I think it goes along the same line as what Andrew was saying, is that I really wonder why, and like this is paradoxical, obviously, because I'm part of this, but like, and we're all part of this, but why we spend so much time and effort trying to fix risk assessment tools. And like, actually, this is like a real question, right? When like, at the end of the day, it's unclear that they're going to be able to achieve anything better than what we could hope to achieve by reforming institutions, right? And which would mean like, obviously, like a long, costly, complicated political effort that would have to like, target law schools, criminal courts, prisons, police departments, like the whole chain, right? Not even to mention like the management of criminal records, re-employment of formerly incarcerated people, etc. And so I just have this like nagging feelings that like by focusing so much on risk assessment tools, we're like rearranging chairs on the Titanic, basically. Like, you know, kind of tinkering with some things that's like seems like an easy fix, but without addressing like the elephant in the room, which is just that the system as it is just really bad and dysfunctional. Is going to be really complicated to fix. And so it's something that I keep kind of thinking about, and like the best like, you know, answer for like why we're doing this is that I think predictive algorithms in the context of criminal justice and policing are like somehow really good metaphors for thinking about algorithmic harms in the 21st century. And so that somehow like they function as metaphors somehow. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling, but I would love to hear what other people, for example, Kristian, what do you think? Do you think it's worth it to like reform risk assessment tools, or do you think we should just get rid of them altogether?
Me? That's a big question for me to answer on my own. You know, I think that is obviously something like society has to answer. I don't think, but I know you're asking for my opinion, and so that's an obnoxious way to answer that question. You know, I think you kind of answered your own question and why people are spending so much energy on trying to fix them, which is essentially that it is sort of the promise of an easy solution to a really, really tough question. I think, you know, there's momentum to keep things the way they are in some way, and you know, and I think this speaks to Andrew's comments earlier about, maybe it was Sarah's, everybody's like saying such great things, I can't remember who's saying them, but about you know, folks wanting to get on board with this sort of big data revolution in some way, not wanting to be left behind. And so I think that's part of it. But really, I think it's sort of the promise of sort of an easy fix to a complicated problem, and it's turning out that it's not.
But it's not an easy fix.
Yeah, that it's not an easy fix.
I can jump in again here. So yeah, you're all really kind of going in the direction I think that we were thinking of as well, kind of thinking about you know, what's going on currently as well, and in the context of how that might be shaping what we're seeing coming in the future as well in terms of the relations to algorithms. And this kind of surged to the forefront of conversation recently with talks about abolition, the general movement for Black lives, and the election. We've been hearing this topic coming up again and again. We kind of see how new surveillance technologies promise to increase accuracy and how they classify and predict. But as you touched on, there are many activists, scholars, practitioners, and in particular, folks who are directly experiencing these technologies that push against these different proposed solutions that are achieved mostly through, you know, enhanced data extraction or continued surveillance in different forms. And so I was wondering, how can we understand the differences between reform and refusal in the context of abolitionist calls to end carceral technologies? Dr. Brayne, would you like to start? I know you didn't speak on the last one.
Sure, yeah. I was just wanting to give time for other folks to ask questions. So yeah, in terms of this like reform versus refusal thing, I mean, I think that Andrew's assessment of sort of the field was relatively astute in thinking about if we have this like continuum with reformers on one end and abolitionists on the other, you know, there's a lot of conflict going on where we are in sort of like an impasse to a certain extent, but even like amidst a lot of resistance from folks and you know what Kristian's talking about with funding and that kind of thing, if we look at city council, even with resistance to defund that may exist, there seems to be across the board some openness to the other half of abolition, which is like reinvestment, right? So like instead of dropping money into new technologies to solve problems in broken systems, or maybe the systems are working as they're designed, whatever your sort of take is, I think as like social scientists, at least, we can focus a little more on this investment side of it, in the sense that like, okay, so right now, you know, we can acknowledge that there are flaws in this existing system, cracks in this existing system. Even if we break it all down, if we build it up again from the same like flawed society, well, it's just going to reflect all of the same issues that already like exist in that society itself. So it's going to require actually a redistribution of resources in sort of like the most basic sense, and redistribution of the power to decide like what tech should be built and deployed on who and in what way and that type of thing. So I think that like there is potential across the board to focus on the reinvestment side of things, because we're stuck in this place right now where, you know, policymakers are caring about, or at least ostensibly caring about, so-called evidence-based policy, right? And we don't have evidence on actually much of anything in thinking about viable alternatives to the police, because we haven't been collecting data in a systematic way. These things haven't been funded systematically, rolled out systematically. And so I think that that might be sort of like a potential avenue for the future in thinking about like, okay, what is this like fully viable operational alternative to the police? What could it be? And then sort of be able to fund that and conduct research on that. But yeah, and so that I think also like gets to this issue you were talking about with reform versus refusal. I mean, refusal is, yeah, don't deploy these tech on our community members who are disproportionately harmed by them. But also it typically comes with like a need for increased resources that are not by default punitive.
I can go. I think there's a really good argument for surveillance abolition, which is that surveillance has never really worked in the way that it was claimed to work. None of the predictive policing technologies, most of the surveillance devices have never worked in any way that wasn't a measure of sort of social control about, you know, low income and communities of color. I think there's also a good argument about why the sort of abolition is a bad idea, which is it might just relieve you with the status quo, which is a broken policing system that is equally biased and equally structurally unequal and equally problematic. And I think there's also a good argument that neither of those is really going to matter, because the technology is going to start to be baked into policing and courts in ways that we won't be able to extricate ourselves from, including like things like these communications. Like everything we're doing is mediated through digital means that's going to allow different kinds of and new forms of analytics and predictions and things that we haven't quite seen yet. What I see where we are now is that in this sort of dialectic, I'll use a sociology sounding word, I'm not a sociologist, but in this dialectic between this sort of abolition and reform, there is a missed a reality, which is that the first generation of these new technologies, which were all relatively small startups or experiments or pilots, which are being killed off in part because they never worked, are being replaced by big tech companies like the Microsofts and Amazons and Accentures of the world that are getting into these things. And we're not going to be able to see into the data collection, the data analysis, some of the predictive stuff that's going to happen in the same way that we could see these smaller companies like Predpol or these organic things that were really one-offs. And so the battle of reformers that has been successful to kill off some of these early technologies because they've been proven to be flawed and wrong, which is great, doesn't necessarily mean that the larger war is won, because they're going to be embedded into what we're doing as we are driving in police cars and police are using smartphones and everything is going to be wired and data driven. And so all of those things are going to create new headaches that we're not going to be able to see in the same way. And many of the same sort of structural power dynamics are going to be there and going to be harder to sort of visualize and get any sort of transparency on.
Great. Thank you so much for your responses. I want to be conscious of time and get to one of our questions that we have from the audience. So we have a question from Anthony Rossi on data sets and challenging their assumed neutrality. And so the question is, the argument has been made that the tools of algorithmic prediction are bad and or inefficient. How might one take a step further and challenge the assumed neutrality of the data itself that goes into the algorithms? And I want to just quickly add a little bit to that question on how do we veer into a sort of positivism as it relates to the data showing it, and how does that idea that data is not necessarily equal to information give this texture? And if I can get Dr. Lum to start, this question is making me think a little bit of your co-authored Layers of Bias paper, if you have any.
Sure. So how do we sort of challenge the idea that the data itself isn't neutral? You know, I think there's this problem we have a lot when we're dealing with criminal justice data, which is that we don't have a solid ground truth, right? Like we don't really know what everybody's doing at every point in the history of the universe, thank goodness, or else we end up in this terrible, you know, surveillance dystopia that I think that we've sort of touched on a little bit here. But that leaves us with a situation where, you know, a lot of times the data we have are measures that are coming directly from the criminal justice system itself. And so, you know, I think some strategies for challenging that idea, you know, we've seen some things where with analyzing the data derived, say, from the police itself. So some of those analyses of stop and frisk, looking at hit rates. So finding that, I believe the ultimate finding was that minority people had a lower rate of actually having contraband found on them when stopped and frisked, indicating there was a lower bar for actually stopping them in the first place. So there are some strategies I think you can do to try to you know, challenge the notion that the data itself is this sort of like fair measure of what's going on. I think it's probably more promising to look outside of data that's generated by the criminal justice system itself. So one of the strategies I've taken in the past, at least with respect to thinking about drug crimes, is instead comparing to public health surveys of drug use. And at least you're getting sort of a different lens or perspective in different types of data on what those patterns might look like. You know, I think something I haven't seen a lot of, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, I think would be to compare, you know, data from other points in the health system, maybe emergency room visits, to have some sort of alternative lens on violence, things like that. So I think that is probably, if you want to use sort of like fight data with data in some way, you know, looking for alternative measures that themselves will have their own biases, but I think give a diversity of perspective that can maybe challenge the notion that any single one of them is unbiased. And of course, listening to people. I mean, I know the you know, the adage, an anecdote is not data, but you know, I think sort of trying to understand the data generating process, understand the bias that goes into generating the data itself, can give really good qualitative arguments in that direction.
I think perhaps just like adding on to this, I've been thinking quite a bit about why data is so appealing. And you know, obviously, like there's a lot to be said about mechanical objectivity and about professionalization. There is one question towards the end that, you know, asks like about the relationship of kind of data-driven processes with kind of professional forces. And all of this is obviously true, and I've seen it a lot in the different cases that I've studied. But I think there is another aspect to data, which, for lack of a better word, I call like a kind of interactionist aspect to data, which is just that a lot of professions and fields see data as like a kind of mirror that's going to tell them what they're doing. And so, but of course, it's a distorted mirror, right? It's like, it's a problematic mirror, just because there is always missing data. Data never quite captures everything that needs to be captured. You know, all of these things that go and that everybody knows goes into kind of data collection and analysis. But somehow, like, I think that like part of the impulse, like part of the allure of data is also that we feel like it's telling us something about ourselves. And I think especially for professions and organizations, it's like, it's very tempting to get data about what's going on. And some things that, you know, for judges and prosecutors, for example, and like, just like pretty quickly, like a lot of judges and prosecutors are wondering if they're doing the same thing all the time. So basically they're wondering if they're being consistent across decisions, right? It's like a big part of like what judges and prosecutors wonder about. When you talk to them, they're just like, listen, I don't know. I have no idea. And so a lot of them are actually asking for more data, just for themselves, right? Just to like get a sense of whether they're consistent across cases or not. And except that, of course, then that data comes with other problems like potentially surveillance, potentially standardization, potentially all of these other things. So I don't know. I just wonder, like, more generally, like, what is it about data that we feel we really need it? Yeah. Anyway, that's a bit of a rambling comment, but.
That was great. We are quickly running out of time. That's what happens when you end up with an hour-and-a-half panel, I suppose. There's just not enough time to get through all the questions that I'm sure we all have. I want to close out on just one final prompt for some of your last thoughts before we all leave today. That we're wondering kind of what can we do to kind of address the bullet train of tech innovation as it relates to your discipline. So we all know you're approaching this from very different disciplinary perspectives. And I think that's part of what makes this really dynamic is kind of all the different ways that we can see to try and approach the question. And so kind of what, if you're going to have one big takeaway from your discipline's approach or perspective on this topic, what do you think is important to be thinking about as it relates to the broader interdisciplinary context? I will pass that to Professor Ferguson first.
Well, it's easy enough to say what we should do in law because we could pass legislation to require various, predictive algorithms and new technologies to be vetted. People have proposed, the equivalent like an FDA for drugs, but for new algorithms. Federal government could fund a program through NIST to see whether we'd want to use these, even the best case, and then hopefully, not just evaluate the technology, but evaluate the technology as it connects with society and the recognized struggles that we won't fix things with technology. So law has an easy answer. We could pass legislation at the federal level. We could have local surveillance ordinances, which I have been pushing for, require, and the ACLU has done a great job nationally pushing for, to require that at least if you're going to adopt a surveillance technology, there has to be democratic accountability and approval. You could write policies. The policing project in New York City at NYU is doing writing policies and thinking about policies for tech. There are lots of things lawyers could do in addition to simply educating yourself about these issues. It's one of the most fascinating issues that you can figure out now of how civil liberties and civil rights intersects with technology and policing power. And there are lots of things that can be done. And the problem is we just haven't had the political will to do it. So I don't have great faith that we will do that. So the only thing I can say we could do is to educate ourselves and think about this and get engaged and try to push your local legislatures to do something.
I'll chime in here. So I think that as Angèle was sort of suggesting, like algorithms are a way of kind of like codifying this like messy social world and human activity and that kind of thing. And we only really are focusing in this moment on changing what we can measure. And so there's like sort of power in measurement and in the very like social practice of it. So like one basic conclusion is like, can we measure some other stuff? Can we think more broadly about the metrics that we are so focused on here? So like in the context of policing, which is what my research is in, we're so overwhelmingly concerned with crime rates. That makes sense. Public safety is a big deal. Okay, fine. But also there's all these other metrics that are really important to community life and to a lot of the things that we are thinking about here. So thinking about to what extent do tools reduce things like racial bias or racial disparities, lead to less stops without arrest, all of these kinds of things. There's all of these metrics that we're just like taking for granted are what we should be operationalizing and what we should be optimizing on. And I think there's a lot of like value judgments baked into those things. So I would sort of suggest that we think more broadly about that.
Can I go next? Because I don't want to be the last person in a sociology panel to close this out. It's a statistician. So I think, as a statistician, I think one of the things we should be thinking about if we are involved in building any of these sorts of models, well, I think there are two things. I think one, being able to take a step back and think beyond the sort of normal way that we approach problems. So normally, you might receive the data and receive the objective of building the model and receive the decision space. So, you know, in the case of, say, pretrial risk assessment, maybe something like these, the sets of decisions that could be taken, do not release, down to they should be checking in this many times, et cetera. This is the outcome you're to predict. These are the features you have with which to predict, right? So sort of taking a step back and challenging each of those things, I think, is probably one of the most important things that we could do, as well as, you know, not being satisfied with models that have poor performance, whether that means they just are they're a lot more noise than signal, or whether it means that it's having a sort of negative impact at large on society. So I think those two things are kind of intertwined, but those are probably two of the most important I can think of.
And so I'll go last. So even though, like, to be honest, I'm not really quite a sociologist anymore, because I'm in a comm department, which, you know, is a kind of like, shall we say, like disheveled version of sociology. But it's just like, okay. So what I will say though, is that, you know, on this question, I somehow go back to my roots as an organizational and economic sociologist. So Sarah says, nice try, once a sociologist, always a sociologist, which I guess is you know, is accurate. But so, okay, organizations and markets really matter. And so I think that, like, you know, one of the things that, like, I'm a bit frustrated with in the current debate about algorithmic technologies, which, like, again, I mean, there are very good reasons to do that, but it's not reinserting these technologies within the social, organizational, and economic landscapes that they participate in. So in the case of criminal justice technologies, for example, I want to know much more about a variety of topics. How do the companies producing these technologies operate? What's their business models? Do they actually make money or not even? Who, like, sells these technologies to institutions, to jurisdictions? How do jurisdictions and police departments operate? How much variation is there across departments and jurisdictions? What about, like, all the nonprofits? So one of the questions was talking about the Arnold Foundation, I mean, Arnold Ventures now. What about, like, the role of nonprofits in shaping the discourse around this question? I mean, I think that really, in a way, like, the algorithms are like the top of the iceberg, and, like, below there is this, like, giant social, economic, and political structure that is in fact really shaping in super important ways what's going on beyond the specific criminal courts and police departments using these technologies. And so I want to know more about that ecosystem. I want to know how it functions. I want to know how it makes money. I want to know how technology diffuses. I want to know all of that. And, you know, there are problems with access. It's not that easy to get access to many of these spaces, but it's not that difficult either, as, like, everybody on this panel shows. It's like, it can be done. And so just, I would love to see much more ethnographic studies of everything, which is, you know, a sociological bias, I guess.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you all so much for being here. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think hopefully everyone who attended learned a lot as well. I feel like we could just talk about this for hours, but I'll let everyone go. I also want to apologize to the participants whose questions we didn't get a chance to address. There were some really great questions in the comments that we ran out of time to answer. So
very, very briefly, at this point, I would say, let me thank the panelists and join me in thanking them. But the audience, they can't see you, so use the chat function to thank the panelists for a really fascinating discussion. I think fascinating and also somewhat frustrating, because I think we all felt that we just dipped our toes in a huge ocean that we will someday will have to cross. And so I think, you know, this is a sense that this conversation would need to continue. Luckily, we do have this workshop. This workshop is going to continue in the spring. So, you know, hold not the date, but we will, you know, advertise the next iteration of this workshop in the spring. So thank you very much again to all the panelists, to Christian, not the last, to Andrew, to Angèle, and to Sarah for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks.